This is Judaism Unbound, episode 512, Antisemitism Beyond Christian Hegemony. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And as we said last week, anti-Semitism is a polarizing topic these days. That's why we wanted to explore it here on Judaism Unbound. Most everyone who listens to this podcast seems to agree that anti-Semitism is bad, but they tend not to agree about a lot of sub-questions, like how it should be defined, to what extent we should or shouldn't worry about it when it comes in different forms or from different directions. So we wanted to see if we could open up this topic in a Judaism Unbound kind of way, not with a full series on anti-Semitism right now, but with two interviews. Last week, we spoke with Daniel May, the publisher of Jewish Currents, jumping off from his recent article about anti-Semitism in Harper's Magazine. And this week, we're speaking with Sarah Hurwitz, who's recently published a book called As a Jew, Reclaiming Our Story from Those Who Shame, Blame, and Try to Erase Us, that offers a very different take on anti-Semitism. This means that many listeners are likely to naturally agree with one of our guests and disagree with the other. But what we always try to do here on Judaism Unbound is to have thoughtful conversations with folks with a variety of points of view and then think for ourselves, which is what we encourage our listeners to do as well. So before we dive into this week's conversation, Lex, are there any Judaism Unbouncements you want to share?
There are two of them. First, we have Shabbat Unbound, the next gathering of our year-long Shabbat service. That's where we meet once a month and have Shabbat together, but we dive specifically into one prayer super deeply. In this month, December 12th, we are going to be gathering and diving into the prayer Psalm 92, a prayer from Kabbalat Shabbat where we specifically say this is a psalm for Shabbat. So that is going to be a good one. You can sign up at judaismunbound.com/Shabbat to attend, whether this is your first time attending Shabbat Unbound or your manyth. So hope you'll head there. Also, we have Apocryphest, our annual Hanukkah initiative, where we dive into books of the Apocrypha, books that didn't make it into the official canon, like Maccabees, like Judith, like many others that you might have heard whispers of but don't necessarily know all the details about. We will be having all sorts of programming for that, including podcast episodes, but you can sign up for our Zoom gathering that will be taking place on the last day of Hanukkah, December 21st evening. So I guess last night, we'll be gathering, and you can sign up at judaismunbound.com/apocrypha. That's APOCRYPHA. Come hang out with the Torah Studio, Liana Wertman and Lexi Kohansky from the Torah Studio, and me, along with Rini Yehuda Newman, the wonderful director of our certificate program in Unbound Judaism. Will be diving into apocryphal books together, having all sorts of fun. You won't want to miss that. Dan, I'll throw it back to you.
Thanks, Lex. And now here's a bit more background about our guest, Sarah Hurwitz. Sarah Hurwitz is the author of two books, the recently published As a Jew, as well as the less recently published Here All Along, Finding Meaning, Spirituality, and a Deeper Connection to Life in Judaism after finally choosing to look there. Previously, Sarah Hurwitz was a White House speechwriter from 2009 to 2017, starting out as a senior speechwriter for Barack Obama and then serving as head speechwriter for Michelle Obama. Prior to her work for the Obamas, Sarah Hurwitz was the chief speechwriter for Hillary Clinton on her 2008 presidential campaign. Sarah Hurwitz is a graduate of Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and more recently, she has trained and volunteered as a hospital chaplain, among many other spiritual and intellectual pursuits. Sarah Hurwitz was our guest on Judaism Unbound, episode 185, where we talked about her first book, Here All Along, which was a finalist for 2 National Jewish Book Awards and for the Sammy Rohr Prize for Jewish Literature. Here All Along has been a beloved introduction to Judaism for many people, including students in our own Judaism Inbound courses, many of whom have converted to Judaism and cite Here All Along as an important influence. Sarah Hurwitz also helped a lot of Judaism Unbound listeners get through the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic when she hosted a weekly streaming video show on our Jewish Live platform called What's Up with God?, in which she interviewed Jewish thinkers and theologians to explore a wide variety of Jewish conceptions of God, divinity, spirituality, and related topics. In her second book, As a Jew, Sarah Hurwitz tries to understand why she and so many others were not raised and educated to appreciate the depths of the Jewish tradition that she later discovered. And she determines that a big part of the answer is anti-Semitism. As a Jew, which was published earlier this year, has been a New York Times bestseller and won the Natan Notable Book Award. So let's dive into our conversation. Sarah Hurwitz, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you again.
It is such a pleasure to be here with you guys. Thank you for having me.
We're really interested in talking about this sort of bigger picture, which has to do with why you set out on this project. I mean, I remember your first book was really about how you, I would say, fell in love with Judaism and presenting Judaism for people to fall in love with you. It was maybe the Hebrew school course you wish that you had taken. And this book, I kind of read it as trying to solve the mystery of why that Judaism wasn't presented to you and others. So I'm wondering if that's right, and if you could talk a little bit about how you came to write this book.
It's such a beautiful, like a beautiful summary of exactly what this was. You know, there were a few things that led to this book. The first was that in the wake of the 2021 Gaza war, I just started to see a lot of online stuff about Jews in Israel that there was some substantive critique, which I think is fine, but there was this really hateful, dehumanizing language that I thought okay, that's different. I also went to a college campus in 2022 and I was speaking to a bunch of Jewish kids and they kept asking me about how I dealt with anti-Semitism when I was in college. And I was like, what? I actually struggled to understand what the question was. And I told them I didn't, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with this. And they were I think they almost didn't believe me. And then the third thing was during COVID, I trained to be a volunteer hospital chaplain. And even the word chaplain, right? It's wait, but you're Jewish. Can you do that? It's yeah, actually chaplaincy is open to people of all traditions, including secular humanists, but it's called chaplaincy, which is a Christian word. And we talked about how prayer is out loud, spontaneous. God, please heal my friend Dan. He's right here. He can hear me making this up as I go along to respond to his needs, which is a gorgeous way to pray. Jews, of course, can pray that way. I wouldn't say that that's a universal form of Jewish prayer. But I was told, no, Sarah, everyone prays that way. Of course you pray for Jewish patients that way. And my Muslim classmate was wait, that's not really common for us either. And my Catholic classmates were wait, actually, we don't really. And it was that's prayer. And I think I began to realize how much I grew up kind of soaked in Christianity, really thinking in Christian terms, language, values, such that spirituality was obviously our bodies are carnal and degraded and bad, and our souls are good because they're immaterial. And the goal is to transcend bad body for good spiritual realm. But that's not the central idea in Judaism, right? That's a Greek idea that might be more central to other traditions. And so what I realized is I'd sort of been growing up. And by the way, this is not nefarious, right? We're in a majority Christian country. We tend to kind of imbibe the thinking of the majority. But I'd been handed a bunch of keys that I thought were universal keys, but they were really keys better shaped to unlock Christianity than other traditions. And I'd kind of been locked out of my tradition. And once I kind of got rid of those keys and really started embracing Jewish keys, I was able to unlock this vastness of Jewish tradition that I was where has this been all my life? And my answer in my book was me kind of exploring wait, why was the Judaism I grew up with so highly edited? Why did I spend most of my life saying, oh, I'm Jewish, but not that Jewish? I'm not one of those Jews, those really Jewy Jews. I'm not like that. I'm spiritual, but not religious. I'm just like you, but I go to a different kind of church. It was this very embarrassed, apologetic, I'm not like those other Jews. But what if I was? What if I was that Jewish? Why was I so afraid of that? And my book was really an exploration of those questions, which involved a deep dive into history and was very helpful in helping me further reclaim this tradition and see clearly what had shaped my own Jewishness.
So can we maybe start with the history? Because this is something that I think a lot of people don't really think that much about, or they have a certain story that we've told ourselves about, Jews came to America. Right. They started to come in the 19th century, most of them, the major waves of immigration, and they were successful. And everything, there was some anti-Semitism, but it was overcome. And honestly, when you and I were in college, I had the same feeling. I recently read Malcolm Gladwell's book, Revenge of the Tipping Point, and he talks about how sports in Ivy League were largely put into place as a way to keep Jews out, because these are sports, not football. We're not talking about football. We're talking about sports like squash and rugby and whatever that actually people don't go to the games very much. And they're why do they put all this money to recruit for these sports and get students that are not necessarily academically up to par? And they do all this for sports. It's one thing for sports that people go to, that you understand that builds school spirit, but why would they do it for sports that people don't go to? And long story short, the answer is it was a mechanism to keep Jews out.
And that's true not only of sports. It's also true of why there are college essays, why there are all sorts of ways to try and discern people's ethnic and racial identity without directly having them say so. There were also ways that it was sometimes asked directly. Like, I think that's a good point.
Right, this was a time when Jews were mostly living in, the inner city and didn't play squash and didn't play whatever, and didn't sail, But the thing is that, right, a few decades later, you and I were in college and didn't experience the sense that it was pervaded with anti-Semitism. Yeah. And so I guess I'm curious from your learnings or from your thinking, like, how do you understand it now? How do you understand the connection between anti-Semitism, even when we didn't really feel it, and the fact that our Jewish educational pathways aren't as good as they could be, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. So the story, the kind of history I want to recount, I want to be really clear. This is history that took place in Western Europe, but many, many Jews do not have roots in Western Europe. They have roots in Asia and Africa. So I want to be clear, like, this is not a universal Jewish story. This is a story about one segment of the Jewish world that many American Jews happen to come from. So looking back at Western Europe in the early 1800s, you see the formation of nation states. You see people getting the rights of citizenship in their countries. And like the question was like, well, wait a second, these Jews seem like a separate nation. This Jewish nation, how are they going to be Germans or Frenchmen? That's a little weird. And there's this whole Jewish question, like, can they actually be citizens of these modern nation states? And Jews made the argument that, like, wait, we are not a separate nation. We're Frenchmen of the Mosaic, as in Moses persuasion. We are Germans of the Jewish faith. And this argument was essentially reimagining Judaism from a pre-modern category that doesn't really exist today, right? Like peoplehood, tribe, civilization, family, reimagining it into kind of a Protestant style religion so that it could be comprehensible to the majorities around us. And, early reformers, I actually have a lot of gratitude and compassion for these people because they wanted to stay Jewish. They didn't want to convert. They didn't want to be nothing. They wanted to stay Jewish. And they thought, like, okay, how do we stay Jewish but not be detested by the people around us? As I was studying this, like, I just felt this deep sense of heartbreak because in some ways, and I don't want to overstate this, but in some ways it felt like they were taking a Protestant cookie cutter and jamming it into Judaism, where it was like, they have a church, we have a Jewish church. They say prayers to God in a dignified way in their church. We will do the same in our church. They have the Old Testament. So do we. In fact, we invented it. But like, we also have 2,500 years of post-biblical texts debating and arguing, really trying to figure out what does it mean to be human. And it is like, so much of our deepest wisdom is in there. Like our morning rituals, Shiva is not in the Torah, right? These are things that we came up to respond to the most like important aspects of what it means to be a human being. But like there wasn't a Christian parallel. And traditionally Christians were actually quite disdainful of the Talmud and our other post-biblical texts. The Talmud is this 2 million word, over 400-year series of debates where our ancient rabbis were like debating about what do we do about how do you be a friend, a parent, a child? How do you conduct business affairs honestly? How do you treat your body? I mean, really important questions. But these reformer Jews, they kind of diminished it. And like that, I think explains to me the Judaism I inherited and grew up with, which was kind of a little bit Protestant shaped. Like I think many, and I don't think I'm unusual, like I think many Jews like me, their only contacts with Judaism are 2 high holiday services that are kind of a little boring. They don't understand. Maybe a Seder, which is kind of nice and fun, and a Hanukkah party, and then like a handful of universalistic values. And like, that's the Judaism. So I actually don't blame at all people like me who look at that and they're like, not interesting. I can study Buddhism or Western philosophy. Like that's sophisticated. This Judaism, it's so obsolete. It's silly, but that's not Judaism, right? Because of oppression, our ancestors to survive, they did this. I have such compassion for them and such gratitude. I don't know if I'd be Jewish today if they hadn't kind of reinvented Judaism this way. And like, it breaks my heart because we kind of lost so much, right? Like, and by the way, I was talking to a bunch of Israelis about this. And this guy kept interrupting me, being like, this happened to us. It happened to us. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And then I realized, oh my God, if you read some of the early Zionist thinkers, they are just as disdainful of the rabbis. And why is that? Not because they were bad, because they were terrified. They were getting slaughtered. And they were like, we are scared. We don't feel like dying anymore or being expelled from countries. They did this because of persecution. And also because of that persecution, they had to endure this terrible loss. And I just feel like I don't feel any anger or I feel nothing but positive towards my ancestors. And I feel a lot of rage towards our persecutors.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad you vocalized that, and we'll put some of what you're referring to in the show notes, because I think for some people, there's really not an awareness around the ways early Zionists spoke about Yiddish, spoke about rabbinic Judaism. I mean, there really was, I think it's fair to say, a disdain there.
Yeah.
And
I mean, they had imbibed the views of those around them, just like these early reformers had imbibed the views of those around them. Like they actually, if you look at them, they're in many ways parroting Christian anti-Judaism.
that's what I want to dwell in, because what I really appreciate is the emphasis on Christian hegemony. I also have, and this will not surprise listeners who've listened to this podcast before, I have significant departures from sort of the then what's of what we do from that Christian hegemonic place. But you draw a spotlight to something that Americans are not taught to look at very much. And I want to get personal a little bit. I want to speak as somebody who grew up as a Jew in the specific context of German Protestant Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which is a hyper significant example of a certain kind of Christian hegemony, because like of all the cities in the country, they all have interesting religious stories, but Milwaukee is German in its construction and creation in a way that really is, not every story has that level of like association with a particular European culture. And it's deeply Protestant, and it's deeply Lutheran specifically. Lutheranism being traced to Martin Luther, a fella who was a leader of the Protestant Reformation, which is what you learned about him first, but which many of us also learn much later. He was very publicly, vociferously anti-Semitic. I say all that as somebody who grew up with, I went to a school that was, it was founded as the German English Academy, funny enough, but it eventually grew to understand itself as non-sectarian, not associated with a religion, but it was deeply Protestant. And I grew up in a context where all of the peer schools, all the schools that I competed with in sports, I went and checked, I had 8 schools in my sports conference that had Lutheran in their name, and one that was called Greendale Martin Luther. That's the 8 plus Greendale Martin Luther. The other ones were Racine St. Catherine's and Burlington Catholic Central and Kenosha St. Joseph's. These were like the daily rhythm of my life. And by the way, I was going and competing against them in sports, often on Friday nights or on Saturdays, and sort of consciously processing that as a Jew in those contexts. And so I wanted to open up a broader conversation, because there's holding and naming the significant impact that Christian hegemony has on all of our lives. And I think that's super important. My earliest memory, my mom loves telling this story, and I think I've told it on the podcast before, is when I was 4 years old after winter break, I went back to like preschool or whatever, and the teacher's icebreaker was, what did everybody get for Christmas? And I don't know why I did this. I already had a rebel in me, but the circle went around, it got to me, and I said, nothing. Nothing. And then she was
no.
Did nothing? I mean, did you go anywhere? Did you and I was like, well, no, I didn't get anything. I got a bike for Hanukkah. And I wish I had video footage of this, but like I literally since a young child, I've been embedded in these questions of what it means to be different from your surroundings. And I say all that because I want to talk about what we do once that's the case. Because so much of your book is going from that and then saying we really should, and this was my own journey too, dive into the Jewish tradition that is not made easy for us to find by our Christian society. That was my own, these same sports conferences, I had to fill out a form to be allowed to wear a yarmulke while running. I had to get a waiver from the Wisconsin Athletic Association because I wanted to wear a yarmulke on Shabbat when I ran on Shabbat. And I was not allowed to because kippah clips were apparently dangerous to other competitors, quote unquote. And I had to get a waiver. Before I got this waiver, I ran around in the 4x400 race with my hand on my head because I was adhering it to my head with Scotch tape because that was permitted to me. And like truly that kind of thing was happening for me. But once we take from that we can and should respond with, we're going to dive into our Jewish tradition. It's what do we do then? Because I found what I dove into was an incredible rich well of text and tradition and stories and holidays, and also a wildly problematic one that is worth saying is not perfect. And that's led me to the work of Judaism Unbound in many ways. It's led me to an organization where we do encourage people to dive full-heartedly into Jewish experience in ways that they might not have been introduced to before. But we also want folks to feel fully comfortable saying, I do have questions about circumcision, or, the ways we do Shabbat services may actually be alienating, or down the list of all of our things. And so because I think a lot of your book is about the first piece of feeling Jewish pride, I guess I'd love to open up for an audience that is also invested in Jewish self-critique and Jewish reinvention, how you sort of bring those together.
I mean, it's funny. This was very much my first book, right? My first book was really this deep engagement with Jewish content of all kinds. It was okay, how do I understand this? How do we engage with this as modern people who, aren't going to agree with all of it and have spent 2,500 years reimagining it, a process that is indeed still going on. That's really my first book. And my second book, the way I think and the way I continue to think about this is okay, this is going to be a clumsy analogy, but just hold it lightly. I think of it as this 110-year-old person who I'm introduced to. And this person has led the most extraordinary life. This person has had brilliant ideas and built thriving communities and also been hated and kicked out of every country on earth. And people have tried to kill this person, but they don't care because they know they have something really powerful. They have wisdom to share with the world. They also think some crazy stuff that's from the 9th century, right? That's from a long time ago that I think is just nuts. And my approach to this person is not, let me get to know them so that I can change them. My response is, let me get to know them so I can be in relationship with them. And relationship is not me trying to change someone or demean someone or say, you are bad and this is good. And this relationship is me trying to understand someone and arguing with them, right? Saying hey, I think you're wrong about that. And also having them say to me, hey, I think you're wrong about this. It's evolving. It's me saying okay, some of the stuff you think, it's a product of your times. It's a product of your experiences. Okay, I don't love it because I see differently because I'm in a different time and a different experience, but I have such compassion for why you think the way you do. Because relationship involves love and respect, right? It doesn't involve 100% acceptance or 100% approval. I don't think that's true. But to me, this is a different category than ideology. It's a category of family. So how do I engage with people in relationship? When I look back through Jewish tradition, I'm there to challenge it and be challenged by it, right? I'm there to have compassion for the fact that it was the 9th century or the 2nd century or the 14th century when this person said this thing. And I don't have to get all up in arms and say, well, they were sexist, they were racist, that is bad. It's oh, no, okay, let me put myself back there. Oh, okay, I see how they were thinking back then. Okay, maybe I would have thought the same way, but that's not how we think today. And I'm not going to take that with me, right? I'm going to understand. But I am going to try to mine it for wisdom. I am going to try to understand it not just as prescriptive, I must do X because person in the 14th century said I must do X, but as descriptive, oh, here is how this person was wrestling with this challenge of being human at that era. What wisdom might I gain from that? It is a very fluid, but also relationship. There's a lot of love. And when you love people, you argue real hard with them and they argue real hard with you. And that's kind of how I think of my engagement with Jewish tradition. And it keeps changing. And maybe in 10 years, I'll come back to you on the show and be wow, I think really differently today. Your relationship with a person is always evolving. You don't freeze it in time.
Which is the challenge of being a book writer, right? Because you have to write a book that represents a snapshot in time.
Yeah, the book freezes you in time. I look at my first book and there's a lot of stuff, not a lot, there's some stuff I would have done differently, and I know in 5 years, I'll look at my second book and be oh, there's some stuff I would have done differently. I love books because they allow for empathy and nuance and complexity and grappling, but I hate them because they're frozen in time.
So I want to tease out the argument a little bit, at least as I understand it, and check it with you, because then the question is, okay, what do we do with it, as Lex has been saying, right? Which is that, okay, so a lot of us recognize at a certain point in our lives that the Judaism that we grew up with doesn't speak to us, is not exactly right for right, and a lot of people I think react to that by rejecting it and by just saying, well, I'm going to do something else. My sense of your, an element of your book is that, okay, but understand that the reason why it was presented to you in the way that it was because of our oppressors. And be angry at them. Don't be angry at the people who responded. They did their best. They didn't always do the greatest job. But let's have compassion for them, rage at our oppressors. And now what? And I think it's interesting because your metaphor of I don't remember you're the old person who's lived this whole life and we don't have to change them is it's great. And it's also, it only goes so far because in a certain way, we're not talking about a relationship with an external entity. We're talking about a relationship with a thing that we're hoping is going to internalize into us. And we are actually going to be the continuity of that. So in a way, it's saying like, I can have a tense relationship with my parent or my grandparent who at the end of the day, right, as we get older, we realize, you know what, I should stop trying to change my parent. They should probably stop trying to change me.
Right.
And I can start to embrace and accept and appreciate what they're bringing. And at the same time, know that at the end of the day, it's going to be my life that is going to go forward and that it's going to be what the next generation is going to have. And so how do we navigate that relationship of respect for what has come before, but then also knowing that we are going to be the one that takes whatever we take forward?
The analogy is definitely limited, but I would say that in some ways it works because this 110-year-old person is not going to live forever, right? We are going to be the ones carrying it on, right? Like we become that person. We are going to keep this going. So you're right. But you know what? Maybe let's step away from the analogy. How do we do this? I think is a really exciting question. Okay, so how do we carry Judaism forward, but like with our modern brains that say like, this isn't gross. This isn't disdainful. I'm not ashamed of this tradition. It's a complicated, messy tradition. How can I now look at these texts, not with hatred or disgust or disdain, but with like curiosity, with open-mindedness, with an intent to be in relation, not thinking, okay, what will outsiders think? How do we keep ourselves safe? Realizing like some of this stuff, nope, we're not, like we're going to do this is going to be a complicated thing, but just without the gaze of our oppressors, but with our own gaze of reverence, curiosity, open-heartedness, could we do that? And like, if we had done that, would we have created the modern denominations that we created? Would we have created reform, which was the kind of like, there was a real Protestant influence? Would we have created orthodoxy, which was a response to reform, which said, hey, nothing new is Torah. Like there was a real reaction and kind of in a way, a little bit of, there was just a reaction and then conservative was a reaction. Like, would these be the denominations we would have come up with? Now it's a silly thing because it's like, what we're going back to, like, what are you talking about? What do we do today? I think what we do today is try to just tune out all of the kind of anti-Judaism, anti-Semitic voices in our society and just say, hey, we have 4,000 years of wisdom from our ancestors. Let's actually engage with it, not just in their time, but in our time. Let's do so with an open mind rather than with, something that really pains me is to see Jews approaching our traditions with a kind of disdain that says like, oh, these things are going to be oppressive. They're going to be bad. They're going to be gross and kind of depraved and kind of, and like that to me indicates some imbibing of the gaze of the oppressor. So like, I want us to kind of look at our text with that lens and with the very traditional lens of we continue to reinterpret. That's traditional Judaism. I'm sorry. Don't tell me otherwise, right? Like we look at the text of our tradition, we argue, we debate, lovingly, respectfully, substantively to try to see like, what's the deeper truth here? Like, here's my take on it. And then Lex, you're going to say, well, interesting. I have a different take. And I'm going to say, oh, wait, that's interesting. That makes me modify my take. And you'll say, hey, wait a second. We're going to get to something deeper and more profound. And then in 5 years, we'll have the debate again, and maybe we'll be different.
What you're making me think about is just that, I've been doing the daily page of Talmud every day with my wife for the last 5 years or
That's
something
awesome.
like that. And there's essentially two kinds of material in the Talmud. I mean, there's lots more than two, but there are two that what you're saying is making me think of. One is the material that's kind of backward looking. It's about the sacrifices in the temple and the priests and all that. And they knew that stuff wasn't coming back. And yet they spent a tremendous amount of time in the Talmud thinking about it. Now, I think that what B'nai Lappi would say is that when they were thinking about it in the Talmud, they weren't really thinking about it. They were using that topic to think about other things and to work out ways of thinking. And then the other part of the material in the Talmud is the more forward-looking, okay, here's what Judaism is going to be now. And when I think about reform, and by the way, when we talk about reform, we're not talking only about the reform movement. We're talking about all of liberal Judaism that came out of the initial...
The verb, reforming.
Yeah, but I mean, I am talking about the reform movement, but I'm also talking beyond the reform movement. I don't want my friends out there that are members of the reform movement to think that I'm dissing them. But when we talk about reform and when we talk about early Zionism, I think that we see a lot of rejection of that old material, and we don't see the version of what the Talmud was doing, which was to still be in relationship with it, to still engage with it, to interpret or not interpret, but to have reverence for it. But reverence doesn't mean that we have to keep doing it. Reverence just means that we respect it and we understand that what we're going to do next is an evolution from it. And I think that maybe, I don't know if this was a 19th century thing, but maybe there was an element in the air back then that was much more about just jettisoning big parts of cultures. And I just don't think that that's how culture tends to work. And it doesn't tend to be very stable on the other end of it when you have just lopped off 1,000 years of your culture and said, we're not going to have anything to do with that anymore. So it's interesting just to think about that as a phenomenon. And it's also, it helps me understand what we're trying to do at Judaism Unbound in a bit of a different way, because we've always been all about change, but also all about reverence for the text and being, Lex loves the Apocrypha even, right?
Right. That's very, I actually love your sacrifices example, because you can say, oh, how disgusting. They were sacrificing animals in a temple. That's so primitive. Or you can say like, wait, the temple was like their conduit to God. And like they approached with like love and reverence, and they were giving God something to be in relationship. Just like, when I'm approaching someone I love, like I'm giving them, not necessarily a physical gift, which is one way of being in a relationship, but I'm sort of like sharing my heart with them. I'm saying like, hey, I have this thought or this concern, or I'm scared about this thing. I'm sort of like putting a piece of myself on the altar, and they're lovingly receiving it. And then they're putting a piece of themselves on my altar, and I'm loving and receiving it. Like sacrifices were not about some gross thing with animals like that. It's like, what was the deeper thing they were about? It was about putting a piece of yourself on an altar and being in loving relationship. Like, can we understand it that way? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just like, I don't know. It's just like looking at my ancestors.
And it was also pretty gross, and we don't have to keep doing it if we don't want to.
Exactly, right? Can we understand like what our ancestors were doing, not just the outward form of it, but the inward heart of it? And can we keep that heart with us? Like, I think that's really what the work is. And it's so heartbreaking for me to hear people being like, oh, animal sacrifices, we were so primitive and disgusting. It's like, no, we weren't. What was the actual beating heart of that? And you can't do that if you don't have compassion. You can't do that if you have internalized the anti-Jewish gaze of those around you. You can't, because it colonizes your heart. If you hate yourself, it's very hard to be in relation with anything. And I hate it when people say, oh, I'm a bad Jew. I hate that. I hate it, because I'm like, no, you are not. You have experienced a centuries-long process that has made you feel that way, and you're not a bad Jew.
Yeah, so let's get at what's leading them to say that, because I think it's not a trivial question at all, and I think in many ways our organization, right back to our episodes where we talk about bad Jew, I'll put those in the show notes too, but I also want to think through what can each of us be saying that can lead folks to further think that, and I want to name that this is a conversation and a book too that really dwells in the realm of emotion. And I'm not saying that as a critique or as a praise. It's like we're using certain words a lot. We're talking about disdain. We're talking on some level about sort of attitudes of repulsion and disgust. And we're talking about how, whether it's Jews ourselves feeling about Jewish tradition through the influence of others or through whatever reasons, or it's non-Jews feeling it towards Jews. Like, we're talking about disgust and repulsion, and we're also talking about pride and love. Like, we're talking about emotional language. This gets to the heart of what it means to sort of do Judaism, or to do any religion. Like, because I'm going to throw in some annoying academic terms, but like, what I am concerned about is that the ways we're talking about disdain, the ways we're talking about disgust, that people feel disdain or disgust towards our ancestors, towards certain Jewish traditions, there's for sure ways in which our societies and our geographies and our histories have led us to look at certain kinds of Jewish things through that outsider gaze. and notice things that might be seen as repulsive about them and sort of take that as a reason to radically shift what Judaism is. That's true. There are also things in Jewish tradition that are awful. And what I am concerned about is if people read about what it means to disdain and to disgust Judaism and to be disgusted by Jewish practices, and they, in their head, sort of conflate that with what I would term, annoying academic term, like a hermeneutics of suspicion. Like, I actually, you said heartbreak, another emotional. I am heartbroken both by people who feel that they cannot embrace Jewish tradition and they cannot love elements of Jewish tradition. That for sure brings me heartbreak in the ways you're describing. And I'm also heartbroken by people who, on their journeys of reconnection or connection into Judaism, feel like they are not licensed to bring that hermeneutics of suspicion, which to me is just as Jewish an act. To read Kol Nidre, for example, which comes up in your book. My undergrad thesis was about my problems with Kol Nidre. It was that I think this prayer is harmful. It cited lots of Jews across many different eras, including the first ever reference we have to it but before the year 1000, where it's called a foolish custom, minhag shetut. Not primarily due to the influence of Christians or anybody else, but due to internal Jewish discourse about this declaration. We need folks to feel like they have the license. In the same way, we're three Americans talking about how Christian hegemony characterizes America. And if anybody wanted to look at us and say we're anti-American, that would be some people want to self-identify as anti-American. I'm neither pro-American nor anti-American, but it's just like, that would be a silly response. And I think the disdain piece, there's a slippage that can come in between telling people, don't disdain your elders, don't disdain your history, don't disdain Judaism. And I'm not saying you're doing this, but I want people out there to know that what we're not saying is don't write a thesis about how Kol Nidre has terrible problems. And it's not. And look, there are anti-Semites in Europe that looked at Kol Nidre and said this is terrible. But that doesn't mean that me writing the thesis about its terribleness is only because of that external critique.
So I want to name two things. I don't want this to be interpreted as like, this is a problem for all the Jews. Like, Mizrahi Jews went through a very different process of entering modernity. They didn't go through this like emancipation, which was like the process by which European Jews became modern citizens. They didn't go through like reform, they didn't go through those denominational things. It's a different approach, which I am like fascinated by. And I think there's a lot of lessons for all Jews in that. The second thing is like this feeling that they can't reinterpret. That is a prime example of the internalization of the anti-Jewish gaze, because they're being told this is a rigid, Old Testament, vengeful religion. It doesn't change, and you have to either accept or reject it. Like internalizing that, like this is a perfect example of exactly the kind of internalized oppressor gaze I'm talking about. The idea that I wouldn't reinterpret, the idea that I wouldn't do not just what people are doing today or in the Middle Ages or rabbis were doing in the Talmud 1700 years ago, but what the authors of the Torah were doing. There was intertextual reinterpretation and critique and debate. That's Jewish. So anyone who is thinking, oh gosh, I'm bad if I reinterpret, reimagine, I think that kind of reflects the heartbreaking internalization of this anti-Jewish gaze. I'm not some newfangled, like, oh my God, like I'm just going to kind of go woo-woo and say like Rosh Hashanah is actually about animal rights. I'm actually someone who really does kind of focus on the text, and I try to be very rigorous, but like, even if you're someone who's just like really out there, reinterpreting is Jewish.
Yeah. I mean, for what it's worth, there is a cool Animal New Year where we could do animal rights a month before Rosh Hashanah.
I was a bad example. And I understand. And Lex, I think what you're saying is there are Jews who say that, right? That you can't do this, but like, let's have some compassion for them for a moment, because I do think it's a response to the persecution.
Yeah. This is a pro-compassion space. I super, super agree. I have a lot of conversations. It's funny, Dan was talking about not wanting to upset Reform listeners. I actually have a lot of conversations with Reform rabbis and Reform leaders who really resent the founders of Reform. And I find myself saying to them, I actually think those founders were
so brave. Oh, wait, but there's something else I wanted to say that I think is really important. I think some of that feeling of like, this is a religion and you believe in this religion or you don't. Again, that's the category error that we made 220 years ago, where we said Judaism is just a religion. we can all reject every aspect of Jewish religion. We're still Jews. We're not a race or an ethnicity. Like, look at Jews. We're all the races and ethnicities. Like, what we are is something deeper. And I think there are a lot of Jews who don't have a connection to Jewish, whatever you think of as Jewish religion, who are not going to a synagogue or studying text, but like they have a connection to other Jewish people. The way we're talking as if this is just a religious tradition that we engage with on a religious level, I think it's so much more than that.
If I'm hearing you right, you're calling on us across historical eras to have compassion, and today, on those who are being shaped by forces around us in society that are causing us to lean towards critiques of Judaism, and the ways in which Christian hegemony and frameworks of religion are leading us to think that we can't really bring reinterpretation and critique. So I'm all about that. What I wanna bring into the conversation is, this is not an episode about Zionism, about anti-Zionism, about that's not what this is about. I do think that everything we're talking about is related to discourse about those pieces, and it does come up in your book. And so I think that this question around hermeneutics of suspicion, do we bring sort of a questioning eye to our tradition? This question on hermeneutics of generosity, do we tend towards giving benefit of the doubt to religious texts or otherwise? It comes up in the context of one's relationship to Israel, the nation state, as well, because the ways in which asking questions about circumcision or kol nidre or whatever can lead to what we've been talking about. Also, the ways in which critiques of the state of Israel or of Zionism as a whole can also be conflated with this notion of disdain. And I want to say, to be really clear, there are people who disdain the nation state Israel. There are people who disdain it from a lot of different directions. That's only increasingly becoming the case as the anti-Zionist right of our country grows very strong, and the anti-Zionist left has been there. And Zionist anti-Semites exist. We could just go to Richard Spencer's quotes from a few. I mean, we could get into that for a long time. That's not the point of this. But I want to bring in that the question of how we relate to Jewish texts and rituals and holidays, and whether we push ourselves to embrace them, whether we veer towards not doing so because we're trying to resemble our Christian neighbors, that also comes up in the question of how we relate to the state of Israel. And what I would argue, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, is that what you said in your book is that there are ways in which anti-Zionist Jews are sort of being pushed by our broader society towards finding criticisms of Israel. I would argue that Christian hegemony is influencing all the ways we have that conversation. The very fact of placing an Israeli flag and an American flag next to each other in a synagogue has been chosen historically to convey to folks, there is this region in the Middle East. Israel of that region is the country that is most quote unquote like us, with all of the various subtexts that can be, whether it's a Judeo-Christian quote unquote subtext that you criticize in the book, whether it's other kinds of racialized context. But in the ways you said before that Zionists in the early days were shaped by assimilation, I think that all of us, wherever our positionalities are today, are responding to and in a context of Christian hegemony. So I guess I'd love to hear whether you would apply the argument you're making about anti-Zionist Jews being pushed by others in their circles towards that, like also to Zionists. Because I know many people in my life who have held a Zionist politics because their social networks and situations have made that a more comfortable position, as I do those who have been on the other end.
Here's what I think is so important to understand about the origins of Zionism. I don't think that this was about like, gee, we think nation states are so awesome and we want one because we like having power. I think it was they are expelling, assaulting, raping, and murdering our bodies. And we have tried for 2,000 years to build thriving communities across the world. And by the way, we succeeded. You look at like the resilience, the courage, the strength of these Jews who built these like thriving, beautiful communities, so diverse all over the world, like really amazing. And also they were repeatedly expelled, assaulted, massacred. And so when I think about Zionism, what I think about is that it was an ideology of real necessity. My ancestors were repeatedly unsafe. And I think they realized that they were never actually going to be safe in the world without a state where they had power. What is like painful for me is that like we just have, I mean, sort of ending now, but we have had a position of such incredible privilege in America And what I see is like people located in that privilege. And I hope this is not going to hurt anyone who holds these views. I really want to like engage respectfully, but kind of like idealizing this theory of exile and saying like, look, we built these beautiful communities. Like, how dare you disrespect that? And I actually really hear that argument. Like, we did, we were resilient and amazing. And they also like slaughtered us by the millions. And so I think like, God forbid, you would never say to a community in America, whether it be women or Black people or LGBTQ folks, you would never say to them, hey guys, decades ago, under conditions of terrible oppression, you guys were so brave and heroic and resilient, and you built like powerful communities, not powerful, you built thriving communities. Like, so let's go back. And what I'm also struggling with is that I think there's a little bit of this category error we made 200 years ago coming back to haunt us. It's easy, if you believe that Judaism is a religion focused on social justice, it's easy to look at the 7 million Jews in Israel and just say, like, these people are not practicing my religion of social justice, right? Like, they're actually practicing the religion badly. What do I have to do with them? Just like if you talk to a super progressive mainline Protestant in Berkeley, California, and said to them, hey, you have to be in solidarity with this Pentecostal in Brazil, they would look at you and be like, what? What are you talking about? That's kind of chauvinist. Don't put that on me. But I think that's a category error because I don't see those 7 million people in Israel as my co-religionists. I see them as my family. And, you know, I have a dear friend who's a spiritual leader of a congregation, and a young person reached out to her and said, I am an anti-Zionist. Am I welcome in your community? And she wrote back and she said, let me be very clear. Every Jew on earth is welcome in my community. Come in. And I want you to know, while we do not do ideology in our synagogue, everyone here is welcome. We do solidarity and family. So we are going to say the prayer for the hostages because like we are standing in solidarity with our family. Whatever ideology you have on Israel, Zionism, like that's kind of irrelevant. But you know, there's a difference between ideology and family. Like that's my family. I'd love us to live in this beautiful exile. I see the argument for that. I understand that some people say, no, it's better to be in a state. Like we can have that debate. I'm actually open-minded about what's the best way. But the way of exile was not a way that was allowed to us. They destroyed our bodies. And I care about the bodies of my fellow Jews. So that's really my argument. And look, I cannot stand this current government. I cannot stand so many of the policies. I am devastated by the settlements. I'm devastated by the Jewish terrorism in the West Bank. Just like I look at what's happening in America, where people who I view as images of God are being kidnapped by masked men in the streets. I am a very fierce critic of this current administration, the cruelty. It is unbearable, just like I'm a fierce critic of the current Israeli government. But I'm a Zionist and I'm a patriotic American, and holding that tension, like, look, it's easier to just hold one pole, you know, but like you guys are not ideologues. I'm not an ideologue. And so it gets messy, you know?
So can we pull up a little bit and talk about this question of how do we make ourselves heard and how do we hear one another in this kind of circumstance? Because I feel like what we're dealing with, let me put it personally, what I'm dealing with, like, I don't really care that much about the extremes of this or any position. Yeah. I mean, like, you know, I care about them as people,
of course.
But I'm saying that, like, I don't feel like those are the people that I'm concerned about how I'm talking to. I feel like the people that I'm concerned about how I'm talking to are the vast majority of people who I think are not at the extremes, but have opinions that I disagree with and that disagree with me. And the question is, you know, you and I think Lex both used the term compassion earlier, and that really, I just felt like, how can we have a more compassionate discourse, especially when the things that we disagree about are profound and kind of feel very urgent, right? So I think that one person could say, right, I find it unbearable that all these Palestinians have been killed over the last 2 years. And another person will say, I find it unbearable that over 1,000 Israelis were killed on October 7th. And it's all unbearable. So essentially, I think a lot of these conversations are like, which one is more unbearable to you?
Oh, God. Which destruction of the infinite image of God is worse? It's like, what
right.
An obscene conversation.
Right. But I mean, I feel like somehow that is the conversation that we find ourselves in. And the question is, how can we...
I think what I'm trying to do, like when I'm, I think about, Lex, like your frustration with the Jews who are saying, how dare you reinterpret? How dare you think you can do that? Like what I try to do is just see what's influencing them and see what is the real human emotion behind that. I think it's fear, but I think they feel very afraid. And like, okay, why did they do that? Well, probably because of legitimate historical reasons. Pretty fair. I'm scared as a Jew now. So like I can be sympathetic. I also think it's like, what is the bubble that you're in? Like what are you imbibing all day on social media from the people around you that is shaping you? And we're just getting more and more radicalized. Look, I obviously lean more towards one side, but like I want to hear the other because I'm afraid I'm getting a filter bubble. I'm afraid I'm missing arguments. But like that's a lot of work, right? For me to demand like every time you hear this argument, you must then find that argument. Like, come on, people have families and jobs and lives. And I think the problem is like we're so siloed. I mean, it's such a cliche, right? We're siloed on media. We all know the critique, but it's really like making us very callous. And so I think the way I try to do this is like, why do they think this way? Are they afraid? Are they getting kind of radicalized by their filter bubble? I'm hearing you say X, like, here's kind of where I am. And like, I wonder like how that hits you. And I can see how you might think that like, yeah, it's a scary time. Like I'm pretty scared too. So like, I get that fear, but I also wonder about X, right? That kind of like gentle, respectful. And look, obviously there are limits, right? Someone who's like cruel or dehumanizing and just really hard ideologue, like you have to have limits, but people who are in the realm of reasonability, I don't know, I think coming at them with that compassion, it does help. And trying to, it's just like we come at our ancestors with compassion to say like, okay, wow, this thing from the 14th century is bonkers, like yikes. But it's like, oh, interesting. Why? What was the real legitimate human fear, hope, aspiration behind that?
So I think what you're getting at here and what your book really dives into is the power of social dynamics. Like, I don't want to say your book is a psychology book. You do actually talk about psychology sometimes.
Yeah.
But the pantheist in me that is very important to my, like the idea that we are not just individualized selves, separable from our environments, separable from other people, separable from the world. Like that's very important to me in terms of my theological lens. It's very, and I also think it's just forgetting theologies of what is God and all of that. It's just like empirically clear that all of us are shaped by our environments. I mean, all of us could go through, the places we've lived, the communities we've been part of, social networks, individual friendships we have, that when we're saying something, we're thinking about how that will be received by like one particular person. All of that plays a really important role in our lives. And I guess what it brings me to is a challenge or a weighing or a tension, which is I want us to be able to notice those social dynamics and notice whether it's Christian hegemony, whether it's our geographic context, whether it's our own demographic realities of being white, or as you said before, being Ashkenazi versus Mizrahi, being Jewish versus something else. Like we could go through a whole list of things, our class, like that's all affecting the political argumentations we make, the religious conclusions we reach. And there's our own reasoning and sort of ways we find our world beliefs that I don't think any of us in this room would deny are also operating. And you spoke about in your book about touring college campuses, being connected to Hillel. And from multiple axes, I'm interested in that. Both Dan and I were shaped by our experiences with Hillel. It's part of the origin story of this project is that we met through Hillel networks, and we met each of us through different kinds of struggles with that institutional apparatus. And I continue to be in deep relationship with Hillels and with Jewish college students more broadly. What I think needs to be held is that simultaneously, there are social dynamics that affect the ways students think about the world, which campus they're at and its norms. We could have a whole separate conversation about going to a university in the rural South and what would be socially normal in that space versus what would be socially peer pressured towards on Israel-Palestine in the Northeast at a private institution that's not Christian. Like, that is all true. And I want to give you the chance to say what I didn't hear as much in your book, which is that still the people, wherever they're concluding in that conversation, on college campuses, otherwise, it's not only that we are thinking about the external gaze and going with what they want. Like, we're exercising our own agency on this too. I guess because I'm sure at your talks at Hillel, you've had people in attendance who challenge you. And Hillel is a context that has specifically sculpted norms that do actually have standards around who can be in the space as a speaker, who can be partnered orgs and who can't. And there's other Jewish organizations that do that too. And it leads to some troublesome conclusions sometimes.
Yeah, totally. I mean, look, what I've seen on campus, and I've been to 29 of them, I've really seen Hillel staff making an effort to reach out to students with really diverse views. And they do come into Hillel. I do get challenged by them. And I love it because these are students who have real critiques, right? They're saying, look, I see this Israeli government policy and I so disagree with it. And here's why. That is so awesome, right? That is like, there's a real like grappling and nuance. It's tough at times, right? Like it can be really heated and hard. I think that is different than something else I'm seeing on campus. And, I haven't been able to explain this except for an analogy where if a group of students said on campus, look, we are really critical of the Chinese government, which like, I hope you are, because they're doing some really appalling things. And I'd say, great, like, please proceed. And if what they did is they proceeded by saying to all Chinese American students, you need to immediately disavow China entirely. You will be absolutely banned from our clubs because we have a no China lovers allowed policy here. And if they held really loud protests screaming, we don't want no China lovers here, that's not critique. I think we can all just say that's racism. And so I just want to distinguish because I think there is a lot of that anti-Semitism on campus that I'm seeing that is very separate from the very real substantive critiques of Israel, some of which I really agree with.
Given what you just said about how en masse policies or even implicit policies about people who love a particular place not being welcome, I'm not trying to ask this as a gotcha, but the part I mentioned about like Hillel and it's not just like Jewish institutions, some of them in articulated policies, which you can find on organizational websites, do in fact say that there will be no anti-Zionists here. Like not that there will be nobody in attendance, but there will be that there will not be folks who oppose Israel as a Jewish and democratic state speaking in those spaces. Like that is part of the policies sometimes articulated and sometimes implicitly held of those institutions. I guess I'm curious if you relate to that in the same way you would with China or Israel, which again, I'm not asking to do you didn't like, I'm just genuinely sort of curious.
Yeah. I mean, look, I prefer engagement. I prefer argument and real like, okay, let's engage with the actual critique and let's like take this down. I'm not going to engage with, we don't want no Zionists here because that's anti-Semitism. And I am going to engage with, hey, I don't like how this war is being conducted. I think it should be different because then that's a debate. So I think if like just things that are just racism, like I don't think you have to have an argument with that. I don't really, that to me, platforming that does not interest me. I think having a debate with real substance, let's have a debate with serious people on substance. And I just want us to be really conscious that a lot of stuff I saw on campus wasn't substance. And that really broke my heart. And I think, and I understand, I think what I saw on campus was a reducing of Israel, which is a country, to the KKK or the Nazi party. So I think it's discerning that line between anti-Semitism and real substantive critique. And yeah, do I disagree about where the line is drawn by some people? I do. But I think it's a pretty nuanced question. It's not a black and white and this, here is our policy on this or that. Like, I think it's nuanced.
I mean, I was in a conversation recently with a lot of college students across the spectrum of Zionism to anti-Zionism. And I said to them at one point, there are people that say that you don't really hold the positions that you're articulating, that a lot of it is due to social pressure. And I know it could be sort of patronizing to say this, but I'm just wondering what you think about that. And literally every single one of them agreed across the entire political spectrum, said that social pressure was a major part of how they were articulating, why they were articulating. Now, what I appreciated about these students was that they were honest. Because if you got the leaders of these organizations into a room, the professional leaders, and you said how much of what you're doing is because you actually believe in it versus because you're facing pressures from funders and from social pressures as well, they often will tell you that in a very secret place. But if you had them in a public place and you asked them in the same way that I publicly asked the students to talk about that, they would deny it. So the reality is, though, that I think that we're in this terrible situation where really important questions are in the air. Questions about the future of Judaism, questions about Israel, questions about so much of this. And I can't help but feeling this struggle that people are not being honest across the spectrum. And they're not being honest because they're afraid. They're afraid of all kinds of things. They're afraid of social shunning, but they're also afraid that if I say the thing that I believe, like, what if I'm wrong? And what if I'm causing this harm, right? And the other piece that I've talked about a lot in this podcast that really is meaningful to me about Judaism is the idea of tshuva, right? The idea of repentance, the idea of saying in any situation when there's a breakdown, it's probably I have a contribution to it. It's not all my fault. That we should never internalize and hate, do like kind of blame it all on ourselves. Of course not. But there's always a situation that probably what you're doing is not right. Probably what your folks are doing is not right. And so little do I hear the question raised by any side of these debates is like, what might I be doing that is contributing to this breakdown? So I would want to say to Hillel, what might you be doing that could be better? Because I never believe that anybody's doing anything perfectly, right? So it's not any knock on Hillel, but it's saying, okay, let's assume that all these policies and all these approaches are not quite right. What could you try differently? And I would say exactly the same thing to folks on the far left, that have been saying, no Zionists here and all that. I would say, like, I don't think that that's very effective. And I don't think that that's how this conversation is going to actually result in a positive outcome. And so I guess like I'm really lobbying for your third book to be this kind of, exploration of what a Judaism might be like that would actually be the Judaism that we need.
I mean, I will say I do think what the far left is doing is very effective because I do think, at least like on campus, because I do think the social cost of having any affection or connection to Israel, regardless of what your ideology around Israel is just so high that students are really terrified to even open their mouths about it. And so they understandably just shut down. So I actually think it's actually been quite effective in shutting students down and in making them afraid. I also think
in the short term for sure, but I mean, I'm saying, has it
been
effective
long term,
at solving this problem?
It's terrible.
And I don't think you deny this either. Like there's a lot of social consequences for holding public positions on Israel Palestine anywhere. I mean, people get blacklisted. People get
anyway. And by the way, I want to please let me say, I also think like on the right, Jews who want to criticize, who have legitimate criticisms are afraid on the right. Like if Jews who are in right-leaning spaces, they often have this fear of just of sharing very legitimate critiques, right? So I feel like I'm sort of ganging up on the left because we're talking about college campuses and that's a very left environment often, but like it's the same exact thing on the right. So like, please don't mistake me as saying like, oh, one side is bad. Oh, no. This is everywhere.
Thank you so much, Sarah Hurwitz, for joining us.
Oh, such a pleasure. Really appreciate it.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As we close out this episode, a couple reminders. We have our Shabbat Unbound, our 12-month-long Shabbat service that will be coming back next Friday, December 12th, as this episode is being released. So you can sign up at judaismunbound.com/Shabbat. Don't miss it. We'll be diving into the prayer Psalm 92, Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, a song about Shabbat specifically, so this should be a good one. And again, judaismunbound.com/Shabbat for that. We also have Apocryphest, our annual Hanukkah initiative where we dive into books of the Apocrypha from Maccabees to Judith to so much more. We've got episodes of the podcast that you'll be hearing where the Torah Studio joins us. Liana Wertman and Lexi Kohansky from the Torah Studio will be my co-conspirators in Apocryphest on this podcast, and also in a gathering we'll be having on Zoom on December 21st. That's a Sunday and the very last night of Hanukkah, so you won't want to miss that. Sign up for that at judaismunbound.com/apocrypha, APOCRYPHA. As we close out, we want to encourage you to be in touch with us with any ideas you have for the Jewish future, follow-ups from this episode, whatever you've got, and you can do that in any of the following ways. First, there's our Facebook and Instagram handles. Both of those are at Judaism Unbound. There's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and all sorts of other goodies. And you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.